So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you today the director of Stanford Global Studies, Jeremy Weinstein, who will deliver the keynote address. Professor Weinstein is a political scientist whose research focuses on civil wars, ethnic politics, and political violence, as well as political economy of development. He's a specialist of Africa, and his work reflects a strong belief in the value of having deep expertise and knowledge in a region, which has also come up a lot today. Professor Weinstein has also served in government as deputy to the US ambassador to the United Nations between 2013 and 2015, and as director for development and democracy of the National Security Council staff in the White House. And in the work that he leads us in at Stanford Global Studies, I think this combination of academic background and really practical experience, is very evident. And so please join me in welcoming him as he comes to deliver his keynote address on why global studies.
Yes, you can take it. People don't want the Coke can in the pictures. Look, I'm really happy to be here with you today. A couple things by way of introduction. First, apologies that I couldn't be with you this morning and much of the day, but I coach my 9-year-old son's. If people can hear me, I'd prefer not to use the mic. Do you need? Okay, then I'll stand back here. I coach my 9-year-old son's baseball team, and he made it to the playoffs. And that was a really big deal. We were we had one of the worst records in the league. We won our first game, which was last week. We were the Cinderella team of the tournament. And today we were playing the best team in the league. And unfortunately, we lost in the bottom of the 6th inning. So I was managing tears, but made my way, my son's tears more than my own, but managed to make my way over here. The second reason that I'm happy to be with you is I've only recently taken over the Global Studies Division at Stanford. And as Jovana and others described to me, the fellowship program and the work that we're doing with instructors at the community college level, I was really excited both to see the seriousness with which a community is thinking about how to internationalize curricula, but also seeing this as an opportunity for group therapy, because ultimately that's part of what we all are doing in sharing our experiences of confronting these challenges in our own institutions. And so I hope you'll bear with me today as I tell you a little bit of my own story taking over the Global Studies Division and how I've been thinking about and trying to address the challenges of internationalizing our curriculum at Stanford. And I hope that's informative to you. I will be transparent about the challenges that we confront and welcome feedback and thoughts from you with respect to experiences that you have that may be beneficial to us. So I wanted to start with why I took on the challenge of global studies, leading this division when I was approached about playing this role last year. And as Jovana said, I really come at this first and foremost as a scholar of African politics. I did my PhD in political science. And the first topic that motivated me as a scholar was trying to understand the question of under what conditions do revolutionary movements turn the weapons that they have against the populations that they're meant to represent. And I was motivated very much by the experience of civil wars in West Africa in the 1990s. I was in graduate school. I was interested in the resistance to dictatorial rule, to authoritarian rule, but shocked by the degree to which violence was being inflicted against civilians by revolutionary movements in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And we see this still in the present day. And for me, that was a puzzle. It was an empirical puzzle to try and understand why movements that were articulating the need for political change or economic change were committing such atrocities against innocent civilians. And that work took me to a number of different countries where long runs of field experience, immersing myself in an ethnographic way in a variety of different contexts, were absolutely essential elements of developing my own thinking about explanatory factors and gathering the kind of evidence to make the argument. This led to my first book, Inside Rebellion. And interestingly, this was a book that took me both to Africa and Latin America. I did work in Uganda, studying the rise of the National Resistance Army, the National Resistance Movement, which took power in the mid-1980s. And for much of my time in Uganda, over 6 or 7 months, I lived out in villages that had been affected by violence in the 1980s, interviewing and engaging people who had lived through that experience about what the violence was like, how it was organized, what some of the consequences were for their own communities. I went from there to Mozambique. In Mozambique, I was interested in understanding the organization and behavior of a movement that was called Renamo. It was backed by the South Africans, by the Central Intelligence Agency. It wreaked a lot of havoc in Mozambique in a civil war that lasted for more than a decade. And I was out in the Renamo strongholds in central and northern Mozambique for months and months, making my way from one village to another. I'd been a scholar of African politics, but this was an immersion in a bunch of local contexts, but that spoke to big and important questions that were being asked in my discipline about civil war and where it comes from and why it unfolds in the way that it does. But that research also took me to Latin America, because ultimately the challenge of violence and violence within civil war was not simply an African issue, it was a comparative issue. And so a part of that field work took me into the Shining Path areas in Peru, around Ayacucho, in the highlands, in the jungle areas where Sendero Luminoso was still active when I was doing my research. And so ultimately the notion of comparison and the notion of immersion are just fundamental to how I think about myself as a researcher. And so it's not at all hard to think about translating that into the classroom, why that's so important to bring into the classroom. My work on civil war slowly evolved, and I moved in the direction of really being interested in identities, and ethnic identities in particular, and how they condition political and social behavior in Africa. And there's a very powerful correlation in the political economy literature that demonstrates that the more ethnically diverse communities are, the more ethnically diverse countries are, the worse they perform economically. And we think about diversity as being a great strength and a great virtue, including here in the United States and in other contexts. But in many of the sub-Saharan African countries where I work, diversity and different identity groups become the important axes around which politics is organized. And ultimately, competition for resources, challenges, and coming to consensus as a society are things that really afflict ethnically diverse countries. And so the second book that I worked on took me into the peri-urban and urban slums in Kampala, which are very, very ethnically heterogeneous, in an effort to really understand what was it about the diversity of ethnic groups that live in these areas that really got in the way of cooperation and collective action. Why were these communities where people really struggled to get along? And again, notions of immersion and on-the-ground data collection and rooting myself in particular contexts were hugely important to the research that I did and my identity as a scholar. So that's one side of what brings me to global studies. The second thing that brings me to global studies, as Jovana mentioned, is that I've not only worn the hat of a scholar, I've worn the hat of a policymaker. And over the last 6 years or 8 years, really, I served a number of different times in the federal government. First on President Obama's White House National Security Council staff, where I had responsibility for working on issues of global poverty and development, human rights and democracy. You can see that period 2009 to 2011, the first 2 years of the Obama administration, were a period where, especially on the democracy and governance front, this was a very intense period in world history because, of course, this was the moment in which the governments of Tunisia and Egypt fell in response to mass popular protest, and ultimately we saw the breaking out of protest in the one region of the world where almost no democratization had taken place over the last 60 years, which is the Middle East and North Africa. And so day in and day out, I was working on that set of challenges for the president. I came back for a couple years and then I went back into government. I sort of had an addiction to the opportunity to be acting in the world on some of the issues that I'd studied as a scholar. And I went to New York as chief of staff to Samantha Power at the U.S. mission to the United Nations and then became her deputy. And had the opportunity to be representing the United States on the front lines of international diplomacy during a period which was insane, to say the least. Now, there are things that are quite insane about the period that we're in now, but this was a really challenging period in global diplomacy and international relations. Our first week on the job after Samantha was confirmed, there was a chemical weapons attack in Syria. And as many of you may remember from 2013, the ramp up to a threatened use of force against the Assad regime, and ultimately the decision to negotiate a chemical weapons extraction agreement with the support of the Russians. So that was the first couple months on the job. Then Russia decided to invade Crimea and then Ukraine. And so the picture on the lower left is Samantha Power confronting Churkin, who was the Russian ambassador to the Security Council. Lots of theatrics, more Security Council meetings per week than had ever been had in history of the United Nations, as we attempted to grapple with a violation of just a profound and foundational norm in the international system about sovereignty and territorial integrity. Then, as it came to spring in this first year on the job, ISIS appears. ISIS begins to sort of take Mosul in Iraq, and all of a sudden we get the emergence of a new form of terrorist organization with provinces all over the world, and a rising threat of domestic terrorism in the United States and Europe that really hadn't been on the agenda since, for many years because of the success that had been had against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And then the picture on the upper right, just to add more challenges to the list, was the breakout of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And I can remember very clearly when the graphs were presented to us in the Situation Room of the White House about the trajectory of deaths that we could expect in the absence of progress against the Ebola epidemic. We now think of this as an epidemic that was successfully managed because about 10,000 people were killed, which is far too many, but many fewer than the million that were predicted before the U.S. military intervention was mounted, which was an unprecedented step. So crises, one crisis after another, but global crises, and all of these are things that have huge ramifications for people in the United States and for people in every country. And so that's the bread and butter of the kinds of things that I did on the international stage. But it wasn't only crises, it was also opportunities. In the upper left-hand corner, you have this extraordinary picture of a refugee camp, which is on the border of the airport in the Central African Republic, in the capital, which was experiencing a breakout of genocidal violence between 2012 and 2014. Many Muslims had fled from the country. It was Muslim-Christian violence by and large, and many had organized themselves in the capital to get out of rural areas where marauding gangs were committing violence. And when we got into government, especially with Samantha's history as a sort of campaigner and person thinking historically about the U.S. response to genocide, we were very focused on how to bring an end to the violence in the Central African Republic, and ultimately made multiple visits to the Central African Republic, got the French troops on the ground, got a UN peacekeeping mission in place, and brought an end to that violence such that we've actually seen a political transition. On the upper right-hand side, you have a picture of President Obama at a peacekeeping summit. We made it a major priority to think about strengthening the United Nations system, and one key aspect of the UN system is the architecture of peacekeeping. It's easy to deride the UN system, to look at the Security Council and say it's broken and it can't act, but what people often forget is that the UN is deploying more than 100,000 peacekeepers around the world in more than 16 conflicts, managing violence, trying to help warring parties take steps together in the context of political transition. And we made it a big priority during our time in New York to rebuild that infrastructure, to strengthen that infrastructure, and part of that meant bringing advanced industrialized countries, in particular Western countries, back into the business of peacekeeping, because in the aftermath of the violence in Europe in the 1990s, and the failures in Rwanda, most European countries and most Western countries had abandoned peacekeeping and left it to the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis, and the Indians. Now we have Chinese troops on the ground, we have Canadian troops on the ground, we have Dutch troops on the ground in Mali. It's been a big revolution in how peacekeeping works. The last picture I have, one of the most contentious issues that we had to negotiate was actually the human rights agenda as it related to LGBT populations. This was a picture of President Obama on the ground in Kenya on one of his last trips to Africa, on the stage with President Kenyatta in Kenya, raising questions in a press conference about anti-gay laws in the region, but also in Kenya. And there were big questions about whether the president was going to stand up and speak about this in Africa, given the overwhelming public opinion that weighs against sort of liberalization and protection of rights for gay people in Africa. But President Obama felt that this was something that he needed to speak honestly and frankly about. He reflected in his remarks on how people had thought about women historically in Kenya and in the United States, and ultimately the evolution of norms that takes place over time and the need to speak directly about these things. So these are the two hats that I wear. One, a hat as a scholar who's fundamentally a scholar of comparative politics, who's deeply invested in the study of particular regions and thinking about comparisons, but also as a policymaker who's had to grapple not only with issues that are context specific, but issues that span regions and have huge consequences for people living in the United States and beyond. So why global studies for me when the opportunity came to me? Well, a couple different reasons. The first is a profound belief on my part that students need to understand contemporary issues that they engage as people, as citizens in the societies that they live, and they need to understand those issues in context, right? They need to be able to make sense of what they're seeing and being exposed to, but that they also need to understand those issues through a comparative and an international lens. And so many of the things that we confront both domestically in the United States but also internationally are things that have comparative and international dimensions, and students really need that understanding. I think the second is a view that I have that in part from the classes that I teach, but also what I see in sort of curriculum, you know, in our middle schools and our high schools, that students today are woefully underprepared for the world that they're likely to enter both as professionals, but also as citizens. And I think figuring out how we collectively tackle that challenge as university and community college instructors, but also in shaping what's done in secondary schools is a big priority for me. The third is that reflecting on my own university, Stanford, I think that we haven't done a terribly good job of articulating the rationale and making the case for the cultivation of global competencies among our undergraduates in particular. And I'm going to talk to you about that challenge that I think we've had at Stanford. But I sort of feel that this is an issue that everyone feels is so important that no one has taken any responsibility for it. And as a result, it's left to those of us who care to try and do things. But as a university, you wouldn't see it if you walked in as an entering student as one of the core things that we're trying to do in terms of our mission. And the final thing, and I'll come to this in my remarks, is that I think it's fundamentally important, and this is what you're doing and sharing in this experience and what I'm trying to generate here at Stanford, that we find ways of innovating in what we offer. Because we have a challenge of actually attracting the interest of students. Because we have a changing demographic that increasingly doesn't think of themselves as having a kind of baseline interest in these issues. And we could bemoan that, we can be frustrated by that, but ultimately our responsibility, I think, is to try and meet students where they are. And that means moving out of some comfort zones that we've been in as sort of strong supporters of area studies and global studies over time. So to give you a sense of how I think about global studies, I wanted to start with an issue that's been very much on my mind, that has been a core focus of research for me since I came back from government the last time, and that's the migration crisis. And I think all of you as internationally interested and oriented faculty are obviously deeply aware of the profound challenges that we're facing globally in terms of large numbers of people moving from one place to another, and often doing it in ways that involve extraordinary risk-taking, as we've seen from the videos and stories that are posted online. And these are just some of the pictures of people trying to make their way into Europe a year ago or a couple of years ago at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. And as someone who worked on these issues in government, trying to figure out how to organize both an international response and an American domestic response to the refugee crisis, I think migration is such an important issue to think about in the context of what is global studies and why global studies, because it raises such profound questions that are central to the societies that are managing migration, but also to the international system that's trying to grapple with the movement of people who are really just trying to protect themselves and to create better opportunities for them and their families. So let's start locally, right? The most local version of the refugee crisis for people in the United States, and this is something that I confronted as a senior official in the U.S. government, is a motivation that the president had to bring in more Syrian refugees to the United States. And if you were thinking about that issue and you were reading the newspaper, it probably quickly became clear to you that there were highly divergent views, even in the United States, about the obligations of our country and our communities with respect to people who were fleeing violence and political persecution. As the president was making a decision to bring more Syrians into the United States, which in essence was a move from bringing in 2,000 Syrians in 2015 to bringing in 10,000 Syrians, right? Given the scale of millions of Syrians who were displaced, this is a small contribution by the United States. We had at one point in time 30 of 50 governors refusing to admit Syrians into their state. Now, they actually don't have legal standing to do this, but all of them had taken a political position against admitting Syrians into the United States and into their own states. And so for a student population that's trying to make sense of what this refugee crisis is, this may be their first exposure, the politics of acceptance of refugees, the politics of difference in their own communities. And we know that actually political views on the refugee crisis are highly, highly polarized ideologically. So when polling was done after the president's decision to admit more Syrians, there was strong disapproval of this movement from 2,000 Syrians to 10,000 Syrians among Republicans, and strong support among Democrats, and very mixed views among independents. So if you think about educating the next generation to think about responsibilities and obligations with respect to these movements of people, where you are, what messages are being conveyed to you, what the partisan nature is of the politicians that surround you, are very much shaping how you think about your obligations and the challenges that are confronted. But if you peel back the onion of the refugee crisis and begin to think about what it's about, it raises all sorts of hugely important issues about the context in which we live and the international system that we now confront, that I think help to make the case for why global studies and the internationalization of our curricula are so important. So first you might ask the question, well, what are the drivers of the refugee crisis? And this chart gives you a sense of sort of numbers of refugees over time. You often hear this described as a moment with the largest number of refugees in history. That's actually not quite right. It's a moment with the largest number of refugees and displaced people in history, because so many of the people who've been displaced from their homes can't actually get out of Syria, or can't get out of Sudan, right? Or can't get out of Afghanistan. And so you have large numbers of displaced people who are internally displaced in societies where they can't locate themselves. But we're almost at a historic high in refugees. But when you look at these rises and fall in refugees, what you realize is that the biggest driver of refugee flows, of course, is violence, right? As war, right? And people understanding why it is that people are moving, not putting them in the category of interlopers trying to get access to an economic system or to pursue a better life in a country to which they weren't born, but recognizing what the actual drivers are of these large flows of people, I think is hugely important. And it's a question that our students should be asking as they try and make sense of the news that they see in the newspaper or on their Twitter feed. A second thing is, if you look at where people are moving from and where they're going to, of course, Europe is focal, not the United States, right? We have huge issues with respect to making this small move in acceptance, but the really big numbers are going to Europe. And I think I see a lot of nodding heads. You all know this, but I'm not sure how much everyone knows this, that the shouldering of the challenges of managing refugee flows, and in fact our obligations under the Refugee Convention, are by and large being borne by European countries in large numbers, who are grappling with, on a per capita basis, vastly more refugees than anything that we would ever confront in the United States with the modest commitments that the president was envisioning. And of course, as you think about shouldering the response to the refugee crisis, it raises really important questions about the international system and how the international system is structured to facilitate this awful word, burden sharing, right? As if we're talking about people here, people, families whose lives are affected. But ultimately in the international system, you're trying to think about where can people go and where can they find a place to work, and a place where they're secure to live and where they can send their kids to school. And of course, we know that Germany, among European countries, is shouldering a disproportionate burden in terms of the number of refugees it has accepted. Now, the European Union raises fascinating questions about how the allocation of these responsibilities should be distributed by society when there's no enforcer, there's no international law that says this country needs to take this many and another country needs to take another amount. The EU attempts to create that structure, but what they find as they create that structure is that ultimately the European countries that don't want to accept refugees simply don't. Right? And so ultimately, those that are willing, Angela Merkel, who's willing, all of a sudden overwhelmed by more than 1 million. Huge questions about the international system and how it works that are raised, again, starting with the contemporary local issue about how we think about our obligation as US citizens around the refugee crisis. And of course, there are interesting comparative issues that are raised about the welcoming and openness to migrants that exists in different countries in the world. So this is a chart that looks at views about immigrants in Europe and the United States. You can think a lot about really interesting questions about the factors that might underlie this variation, right? Why is it that Germany and the United Kingdom and the US, for example, are 3 of the countries in the world that are most open to immigrants and migrants and see them as strengthening the fabric of their society? Whereas if you're in Poland or Greece or Italy, the immediate orientation of a country is to see migrants or refugees as a burden. These are the kinds of questions that are opened up by thinking about the refugee crisis. There are also questions opened up about policies, right? What kinds of policies do governments adopt, not just in terms of opening their doors to let refugees in, but to what extent do governments make investments in the people who arrive? And what do those investments look like in terms of language acquisition, in terms of access to employment, in terms of access to public services? And these are things that vary dramatically even across Europe. As a social scientist, these are questions that I want to understand, but I also want to challenge my students to think about. There are also differences in outcomes and not just differences in policy. Right? This is just a chart that represents variation in employment rates for foreign-born populations in different countries of Europe. And you can see the difference in terms of the overall unemployment rate and the unemployment rate of the foreign-born as a way of thinking about which societies are doing a better job of taking new arrivals from elsewhere, and integrating them into their own society. And of course, there's an issue that has got to be front and center in our mind today, which is what are some of the knock-on effects of the migration crisis? Not just the management of the movements of people, but how political attitudes are shaped and formed as you change the demographic in your own society. And of course, the rise of right-wing parties, the rise of nationalist parties, the Brexit vote, the rise of Le Pen in France, the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria and others, is reflective of societies trying to make sense of how they think about their own identity in the face of these changing demographics. I could go on, but I think the point is clear that an issue like migration is one that has a profound local context, that our students will be confronting as they think about the politics of everyday life where they live, but using that as a lens to open up bigger questions about other contexts, about drivers, about the international system and how it's structured. That's why global studies, right? That's why global studies is needed. And I came back, I spent 3 months in South Africa this year with my family at Stanford's overseas campus. And South Africa was grappling not with the Syrian refugee crisis. Very few Syrians have made their way to South Africa. It's a very long distance to go. But xenophobia against immigrants was one of the top 3 issues on the table in South Africa during my 3 months. It was focused on Somalis. Somalis had made their way from Somalia in the Horn all the way down to southern Africa and had located themselves. And Somalis are very often enterprising in the business sector and had positioned themselves in South Africa's urban townships where unemployment rates are 40 or 50%, and they had become very successful business people. But ultimately, in a period of rising unemployment, in a period of growing dissatisfaction and alienation from the South African government, scapegoating of immigrants was a very effective strategy, and it was one basically endorsed and pursued by sitting government officials trying to deflect attention from their own underperformance vis-a-vis the needs of their own citizens. You also had a counter movement, the We Are All Africans movement, that was coming up because, of course, during the apartheid regime, when South Africans were pushed out of their own country, it was Zambians and Botswanans and Zimbabweans and others who welcomed them in and gave them a base. But these contentious issues that we are grappling with respect to changing demographics and the movement of people are not just Western issues, they're African issues, they're Latin American issues, and they're profoundly issues that make us think about the importance of the work that we do as educators interested in both regional and global studies. So the points for me are making sense of local concerns involves understanding comparative examples and global processes. And that I gave you the example of migration, but take any of the contemporary issues of the day, migration, poverty and inequality, the decline of industry, the automation of work, political polarization, terrorism. These are all questions that, as we grapple with them, introduce all the same kinds of dynamics as the migration process. And what we need, and I think we need to be doing at Stanford, is giving students a structure for thinking about the causes and consequences of these contemporary challenges, how these issues are experienced in a wide diversity of contexts, and ultimately how global dynamics factor in. So as I bring these different hats that I wear to bear on my role in global studies at Stanford, motivated not only by my past experiences, but also by the questions that I'm interested in as a researcher, I then begin to think about, well, what are the challenges of preparing our students at Stanford to enter both the professional world and the world that they confront as citizens? And there are three challenges that I think we're grappling with at Stanford, some of which may resonate with you, others may not, but I wanted to share them just so you have a sense of what I see. The first is that students are arriving with a radically insufficient grounding in regional and global issues. And I think obviously it depends on the schools that they're coming from, but high school curricula are not always evolving in the direction of introducing these topics with sufficient depth. So I often feel when I'm teaching an introduction to comparative politics class or an introduction to international relations class that students don't know much history and they don't know much about the world. And that makes it hard if you're developing and testing theories if people don't have empirical material that's a basis for helping them think about the problems that you're raising. The second, and I don't call this isn't a problem, this is just a reality for us, which is that students are being pulled dramatically in the direction of STEM fields and in much more applied and vocational directions. And in particular for us at Stanford, that the heavy major requirements that are involved in these fields means that the space in students' mental, space, but also their schedule is just shrinking for the kinds of things that I feel are so central for them to take away from an undergraduate education. And then the third is that the funding that traditionally supported us to do this work is under threat and in decline. And ultimately, that's a challenge for us as an institution that built up its platform for working on these issues with the support of the federal government, over 40 or 50 years. So what do these challenges look like in detail? There was a survey of global literacy, that Jovanev shared with me that was done by the Council on Foreign Relations and the National Geographic. They surveyed a random sample of young people, 18 to 25 years old. They were asked a series of basic and factual questions about the world. And I'm going to show you 6 of these questions, and I'm going to ask you which of these questions do you think the majority of young people answered correctly? Okay, so here are the questions. In which of these countries is a majority of the population Muslim? Which languages, I've bolded the answers just so you don't have to worry that you may not know the answer, right? I wanted to take that. So which language is spoken by the most people in the world? Which country is the largest trading partner of the US? Approximately what percentage of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid? Which countries, should say countries, not counties, is the United States treaty bound to protect if they are attacked, not attached? You can see I did this late last night. And over the past 5 years, the number of Mexicans leaving the US and returning to Mexico has been greater than the number entering the US, true or false? Which one of these do you think a majority of young people got right? None. Exactly. Not a single one, right? The results are devastating, right? In terms of basic factual knowledge of a random sample of young people coming out of high school. Not a single one of these did a majority get right. So that just gives you a sense of where all of us are starting as we confront this challenge of internationalizing our curricula. We also have a challenge, and you can tell me whether you share it as you look at the interests of students who are entering your schools, that we're seeing a significant shift in what students describe as their core area of interest, the disciplines that they're going to choose for majors over time. And in particular, those disciplines with significant regional or international content are suffering the greatest declines. Those are particular disciplines in the social sciences. Humanities have been largely flat. Social sciences are experiencing big decline. And students are really shifting in the direction of STEM fields. We're also seeing in parallel big drops in language enrollments. And we even have a language requirement at Stanford, but many students are meeting the language requirement with what they did in high school and never taking language again, right? Or taking one course. So by the time they graduate, their language capability has eroded, and they're not entering the professional world with a language capability that would be useful both instrumentally, but I think we also recognize that language acquisition is important for more than instrumental reasons. Because if you're interested in empathy, if you're interested in perspective taking, ultimately being able to communicate with people in their own language, to read literature in another language, to see how objects and issues are identified and talked about, this is something that exposure to another language enables. We also find that once students make this shift in a vocational direction, in particular, our students in STEM fields are far less likely to study abroad, far less likely to pursue work experiences abroad. So not only are they losing exposure in the classroom by virtue of their curricular structure, but they're not even getting the co-curricular experiences that would be so important to an undergraduate education. And this is one of these awful charts that, at least on campus, is shown in every presentation, which is just to describe what's happening to our own undergraduate population at Stanford. The lines, the vertical lines are the dot-com bubble and the recession peak. But what you can really see here is a huge decline in social sciences from almost 30% of our majors down to 15%, and a dramatic rise in engineering. Basically, social scientists, economists, political scientists, sometimes historians, they're all moving in the direction of engineering. That's largely growth in computer science. And so this, I think, frames for you the challenges that we confront here. This is the majors. Of course, we're also not seeing these students in as many courses that we teach, even if they choose not to major in the fields that are so central to global studies at Stanford. And then, of course, our last challenge is, how do we even pay for the global studies education that we want to be able to offer our students? And this is what has happened to global studies funding over time that comes from Title VI, the US government. The green line is the important one to look at. And you saw big growth after 2001, the September 11th attacks, a real focus on rebuilding universities' strength in these issues, and now it's begun to crater. And of course, the expectations for the Trump budget are even worse than anything that we saw under Obama. And so the challenge for universities that are attempting to maintain strength in these historical areas of focus in our regional studies centers and our global studies program is, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to invest in having the relevant folks who can offer languages on staff, the faculty that we need to teach courses, the resources for research, the resources for the outreach and engagement that we're doing here that put us in a community of exchange with respect to how best to manage these challenges. So as I've thought about these challenges on my own journey in the last year, thinking about global studies at Stanford, I've begun to think a lot more through the lens of what some have called global competencies, recognizing that many of the students that we are going to need to target and reach will not be students who have as their core identity, I'm a student who's interested and my passion is in South Asia. And so that's my community on campus, the South Asia scholars. I go to all of their events. In fact, I think our challenge is going to be looking outward to the university. We have these core students, but that's an ever-shrinking group. And we need to reach all the students on campus, and we need to figure out how we get to them. And I think this notion of global competencies is helpful for that. We may not get students in a major, a global studies major or a global studies minor, but we need to find new and creative ways of touching every student during their Stanford experience. People who've thought about global competencies have talked about a set of core capacities that they want students who have these competencies to demonstrate. They talk about a number of different things, that students should be able to investigate the world beyond their immediate environment, being able to frame significant problems in the world and conduct well-crafted research. A second thing that they talk about is recognizing perspectives, both their own perspective and the perspectives of others, perspective taking, and being able to articulate and explain those perspectives in thoughtful ways. A third core capacity is being able to communicate ideas effectively with diverse audiences. Understanding who you are and how you're perceived by others is hugely important to that. That's not just an issue of language. And of course, there are all sorts of barriers and elements of diversity that ultimately all of our students are going to need to confront in whatever work and social environment in which they find themselves. And then for a lot of people who think about global competencies, there's this like hidden subversive action agenda that's a part of this movement as well, which is a recognition that given the kinds of challenges that we confront globally today, we really want to prepare students who not only can make sense of the world that they see, but figure out where they fit in it, right? How it is that they can take action, how they can have agency and not be overwhelmed by the problems that they see and end up as passive in response. And of course, if you haven't found your way to this literature, we can get you some of this literature that's developed both around the university system and the high school system with respect to thinking about global competencies. What that's meant for me in terms of thinking about goals at Stanford is that we really need a framework on campus that looks both at the curricular side and the co-curricular side in terms of 4 different goals that I have for Stanford students. The first is spurring and sustaining the curiosity and interest of Stanford students about the world. You might take that for granted, but living here in Silicon Valley, I just don't think you can. That ultimately we have an obligation to our students to get them to look up and out and away from Silicon Valley and think about global issues and think about other contexts and be able to properly locate what's happening here and what's different about here from other parts of the world. And that really is about generating demand for what we do. We need to generate demand. We need to spur this curiosity because often it isn't there. The second is that we need a goal of sort of giving students context, knowledge, and tools to investigate questions with regional and international dimensions. And that's things that we do in the classroom. It's also about language exposure. It's about problem-solving skills. It's about the disciplines that we engage in this effort. We need to find new and creative ways of fostering this openness and the ability to recognize and learn from diverse perspectives. And then I think, consistent with that action agenda, our students are motivated by wanting to solve problems in the world, and we need to create opportunities for them, sometimes in the classroom and sometimes through co-curricular structures, that put them in a position where they're able to connect the learning to the action, because that's so important. That's part of what is so exciting for students about computer science. You know, we get 1,000 students taking computer science, the intro computer science course every year, and they are producing something. They can see what it is they've produced. They can run that program. They can show it to their parents. They can take it forward as a marketable skill. And so we are not just providing people with context. We need to put them in a position to think about how they act in the world and act on things that excite them and motivate them. But that all brings me, and I'll end with this and open it up to questions and reactions from you, but to a real need for innovation. And why do I say a need for innovation? Well, one, I think when we look at our incoming student surveys, one of the things that we find is that students actually do provide evidence of some interest in the world, a recognition that learning about other countries and cultures would be something that's beneficial to them, something that they ought to do during their undergraduate experience. The problem is that we lose them after they get here, right? They come thinking they're going to have this really broad education when they arrive, and then they're very quickly funneled into some channel, and the space for doing that is eroded. Many students are not naturally coming to us, and so we need to find ways of getting to them. We also need to be very serious about breaking out of the community at Stanford that thinks of itself as the global studies community, right? We don't have a challenge with scholars of comparative literature or people in the history department or anthropologists or political scientists. All of that community recognizes the value of what we do. But we need to be doing a lot of work with our chemistry colleagues and our biology colleagues and people at the School of Earth Sciences and Engineering to think about global issues and how they're relevant to the students that they're training. You know, I've been working with a physics professor who says, look, there is no graduate of my PhD program who will not be involved in a major international scientific collaboration. And nothing that we are doing to train them as chemists is preparing them to engage in an international scientific collaboration. It requires skills and capacities and expertise that we are not providing. So how do we get them that capacity and expertise? That is our responsibility, I think, as the Global Studies Division. But I think we also, getting at this demand side issue, need to figure out new ways of branding, promoting, and recognizing the acquisition of global competencies. The way that this has traditionally been done is through majors. But if you're not going to get all of these students to you through majors, because they're choosing other majors because of societal factors, because of the economic space, the opportunities that are available to them, or for many of them, parental pressure that's coming from home at a time where people's economic futures are more uncertain than they've ever been in the past. How is it that we broadcast to people the importance of acquiring these competencies and recognize them for doing so? And so I'll just end by saying the kinds of things that we're thinking about at Stanford, some of which may be relevant for you, some of which may not be, are areas where we can push out in new directions from the traditional ways that we offer pathways for students into some global competency and expertise. One is to think very seriously about how we engage students before they come. Some of that is engaging you and sort of communities that are teaching students before they arrive at the community college level and at the high school level. Others are taking advantage of basically a movement that's afoot, which I think is a really good movement, which is students are really not that ready to come here at age 18. It'd be great if they didn't come till age 19 or even age 20, or some people would say age 25 or 28, when they actually have a sense of what the value is of showing up at lecture and doing the reading and completing their assignments. So, you know, the bridge year movement, the notion of a gap year, which is big in other parts of the world, but really taking off in the United States, is something we're thinking about, because ultimately Princeton has experimented with this, and they're sending right now about 40 students abroad a year before they start at Princeton. And they're tracking their intellectual trajectories after they arrive at Princeton. And they're vastly different than the students who aren't going abroad. Now that's some because the students who are choosing to go abroad are different than those who don't. But ultimately, if you can attract students and generate this kind of meaningful real-world content that shapes the questions that they ask in class, the courses that they choose to take, the problems that they want to work on, that's potentially a very exciting path. There's a great program called Global Citizen Year out there, which is pushing the movement toward gap years, working with all sorts of different kinds of universities and schools to think about appropriate models. It's something we're thinking about at Stanford. I'm also really pushing us as a faculty to think about how we reach students in their first year and in their second year. And in particular, thinking about what we teach. Ultimately, I think we want to bring students into classrooms, not just in small seminar settings, but in big lecture courses that capture students with contemporary issues that have important historical, comparative, regional, and international dimensions. One of my colleagues is developing a class next year on populism, right? Populism is the issue of the day in so many societies. And ultimately using a contemporary issue that can pull students in as a lens for thinking about populism in historical perspective in the Latin American context, for thinking about the rise of populist movements in interwar Europe. But you need to capture them not through the focus on the region always, but through a focus on an issue, right, that captivates, that's cross-cutting. And we've implemented an innovation grants program where we're working with faculty in lots of different disciplines to try and think about what are those issue areas that will captivate students and bring in large numbers so that we capture them before the CS pathway is totally defined or the engineering pathway is totally defined. I also think we need to radically re-envision how we teach language. We teach language often 5 days a week at 8:30 in the morning. And this is a really good way, if students are highly motivated, to make sure that there's nothing else competing on their schedule except for sleep. And they show up every day and they get a sort of language exposure. But for students who aren't that highly motivated, which is most of our students, where the trade-off between sleep and further language acquisition leans very much in the direction of sleep, we really have to reinvent this model. And this is a challenging institutional model to reinvent, because ultimately offering courses every day, right, is sort of how we sustain and finance our language instructors, right? And so if you were to think about radically different models that focus on summer exposure or residential language experiences or integrating language training with work experiences overseas, what does that mean for how we think about having on campus expertise and competency in language instruction? So we don't have a structure that allows for much innovation as we're currently structured, but we've got a crisis with respect to language acquisition that we have to confront. The fourth is to figure out how we develop study abroad experiences that basically pull in students who are not in the humanities and social sciences. Those students sign up for this stuff. They go abroad for 3 quarters. They'd be happy to do it for 6 quarters if they could. It's like checks on a box on a resume, all the different experiences that they want to take advantage of. If you're in the natural sciences or engineering, it just looks impossible to you. And part of the reason it looks impossible is that you can't continue on your own intellectual progression in your field if you go abroad. It's seen as a quarter off. And that's not going to work over time. That means for us rethinking what our overseas experiences are like, how an engineering student that wants to study in China or in Japan or Berlin is able actually to continue their engineering education while they're abroad. Or a biochemistry student who is studying in France is able to engage scientists at the Pasteur Institute, right? One of the world's leading institutes for biomedical science. That is not the way study abroad was constructed. Study abroad was constructed 40 years ago as a sort of rooted experience in kind of another culture, largely humanities, some social sciences, and a quarter off from whatever kind of professional path you're on. But with our highly vocational students that we have now, it's just not a selling point. And ultimately, that requires some re-envisioning. For me, that isn't a rejection of the humanities and social sciences. In fact, I think you could learn a ton by being a biomedical researcher in the Pasteur Institute, especially when you're then living abroad, you're engaging in a different context, and you have humanities and social science courses in addition to that pathway. And then the final thing that we're thinking a lot about is how we create opportunities for students to be a part of global problem solving while they're in their undergraduate education. And that means in part opportunities to work with faculty who are addressing climate change or resilience in response to climate change, working on the future of urban infrastructure in growing cities and developing parts of the world. We're full here of faculty who are thinking about these problems in real time, and finding ways to connect students to the problem-solving element that's at the core of research is exciting, but also finding opportunities to get our students into real-world experiences overseas through internships. These are the kinds of areas for innovation that I think we are grappling with as we address a common set of challenges that I think you confront, which is underprepared students who are very concerned about the economic trajectory that they're on, that pulls them in vocational directions, but that ultimately that will leave all of us unprepared, them for the professional careers, and all of us as a society for the global and sort of diverse cultural elements of the world that we confront in this day and age. So with that, let me open it up for questions or reactions or experiences that you want to share that will help us as we try and make sense not only of why global studies, but also how to pursue global studies at Stanford going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I have 2 questions which are related, and I've been struggling to how to phrase them properly. One of the earlier presentations I went to was on the different global studies programs in the world, and the numbers that I got is that there's about 317 of them, 300 of which are in the United States. So are we doing, in those programs, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Like, what's the effectiveness, given what you're telling us, that we seem to be very American-centered compared to the rest of the world? That's my first part of the question. The second part is with relation to Germany, which is an amazing story, given that in 1930s, that was the place where people were fleeing, there were some of the worst things in the world were happening, and nationalism was reaching some of its ugliest things. And yet, right now, it seems to be a place which accepts the highest number of refugees. It has a completely different opposite from many other parts of the world. What explains this? Is there something in their educational system which answers the question, like, what's culturally different about Germany right now?
I wish I had an answer to the second question. I'll speculate wildly about it after I answer your first question. So, one of the interesting things about these 3 months that I spent in South Africa this year is that there was a movement afoot in South Africa to decolonize the curriculum. So if those know, sort of paying attention to the movements that are afoot on U.S. college campuses now about not only who teaches in the classroom, but what's on the curriculum. And I saw that in a number of the presentations that were shared with me that you all did this morning, taking a look at what is being taught, what are the best kinds of materials that ultimately offer something more than, a Eurocentric perspective on issues. And so the South African educational system was grappling very much with the colonial, the received from colonial rule, Eurocentric curriculum of its African universities, right? And so I think we are seeing an effort around the world to sort of reclaim space for diverse perspectives and non-Western perspectives in curricula overseas. But I would also like to see that accompanied by, and this gets to the xenophobia kinds of challenges in South Africa, also by an openness to understanding other contexts. So, 300 of the global studies programs are in the United States. There's almost an identity and a goal in the United States, given the power that the U.S. has had in the world, our interests that are so diverse around the world, of being able to understand contexts overseas. But the challenge in South Africa was a desire to reclaim the curriculum from the West or from Europe, but not a real interest in the diversity of Africa or the diversity of other parts of the world. And that's ultimately a challenge. I think that's a challenge for this as a scholarly movement, as a field of study, how to both introduce this diversity of perspectives and encourage the kind of openness in every direction that's needed. And of course, in part, that's a question of resources. It's a question of having faculty who have these interests and have had experiences in different parts of the world that will enable them to teach students and create opportunities like this. So it doesn't surprise me, that statistic that you described, but I think it does speak to something that's unique about the United States and the way the U.S. looks at the world, but also the challenges that exist elsewhere. With respect to Germany, we could spend a lot of time thinking about this, but ultimately, and I'm no expert on sort of German social welfare policy as it relates to the refugee system. But ultimately, as Germans have begun to think about their sense of responsibility in the aftermath of World War II, that is something that's deeply embedded in the German educational system that I know from German colleagues and German friends, how they think about the consequences of World War II, their responsibilities for World War II. And of course, there's no consensus in Germany either, right? The challenges that Merkel faces for having made this decision, the rise of opposition to Merkel, and ultimately questions about whether her administration will survive, are motivated very much by this far-reaching action that she took. But I think Germans, very much because of their educational system, have a profound sense of ethical responsibility to be on the receiving end of those who are fleeing violence that is very much related to the horrors of World War II.
One quick question. I was trying to relate your field experience, research experience, that you spent time in conflict zones studying this as a scholar, and finally joined the administration where you have to make a decision or help decision makers making the right decision. To what extent has your field experience as a researcher helped making the government make the right decision? In other words, I was telling my audience this morning that in most places when we involve in conflicts, we involve without insufficient information. We don't know how those societies that we intervene work. Yeah. We just remotely, it may depend on only 2 weeks review by CIA surveillance or make a casual observation and then you recommend the government, let's do this in these places, which is totally different from knowing the society as a scholar, living with the people, getting the inside information, like living an anthropologist. it gives totally different results. So how far has your experience in this conflict zone as a researcher helped governments, either in New York or in Washington, D.C., to make right decisions in conflict resolution or in interventions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if I was so powerful as to ensure that the right decisions were always made, I would be quite powerful, and I was not that. But I think just to give you a sense of my own desire to be a scholar, it came very much from actually having worked in government in the Clinton administration. And I worked on Africa policy at the Clinton White House in the 1990s. And this was after Rwanda. And I was there at a time when conflict was breaking out across sub-Saharan Africa in some very serious ways. Rwanda and Uganda invaded the Congo. You had a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. You had a civil war in Guinea-Bissau and violence in Nigeria after Sani Abacha's death. And as I sat around the table, I was, a young person at the time, and I looked at the kinds of contributions that people were making to the discussion of what the U.S. should do in those contexts. There were two kinds of people at the table. There were people who were policy experts who sort of had a surface level understanding of these issues. They were maybe career foreign service officers who'd spent 2 years in different places moving from one thing to another, or people who could basically write the equivalent of like 2 pages of a sort of well-researched memo on the conflict with a set of policy options. And then you had a couple people at the table who had lived in this part of the world for decades, who basically knew all of the political leaders by name, who could think about the hidden ethnic and cultural dynamics that were at play in the context of the violence that was unfolding, who had a sense of whether and under what conditions the levers of power that the U.S. had might actually be relevant to affect the political calculus of elites in a country very, very far away. And I watched this from the back row of the room, and I said, I want to be like those people, right? I don't want to be 2 pages deep. I want to be someone who brings to the conversation a level of knowledge and expertise such that I have a lens through which to understand what's happening on the ground and to really think about, not just what the United States should do, but whether the United States should do anything and whether it would ultimately have beneficial effects or harmful effects. And without that rooted understanding, I think people are often missing something, as I think you're alluding to. And so ultimately, that's what led me down the path of being a scholar rather than sort of spending a career in the policy world, that ultimately I wanted to bring that understanding to the table. And I'm not going to answer in detail your question, although I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But I'd say that as I found my way to ever higher levels of government service, I often wasn't the expert anymore. I spent a lot of time working on the Middle East and North Africa or on the response to the war in Syria. I was not an expert in any of those places. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know the history in depth. But I did know what expertise was. And by virtue of knowing what expertise was, I was far more aware of what I didn't know. And ultimately, that made me a sort of rapacious consumer of information from those people who did know things, right? And I think that always isn't there. And so ultimately, that part of my identity that is an expert, that is rooted in a place, was hugely important to all the policy decisions that I engaged in.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to your concern and perhaps to add a little bit. I don't know what your subtext was, if there was any, but embedded in that question, to me it seems that somehow the United States is taking on the responsibility of doing global studies. What came to my mind is that as a discipline, global studies is very much founded in cultural studies as it came out of the model of the British model, born out of the 70s, and that born out of a decolonization of half the world, if not more, and that Western need to understand what had happened, what the result might be. And so maybe a sense of guilt, I don't know, but the idea that it seems that the United States has so many different global studies programs, or that the Western world does, well, rightly so, because we've always thought of ourselves as the standard, the normal, and that everyone else had to explain themselves. And so, I don't know, I just wanted to offer that.
One of the things that I struggle with when I'm, designing and thinking about classes is that how information is given to our students has changed dramatically over my lifetime. What I see now is much more information is sent out and people want to be entertained. Whereas when I was a child, when you watched Huntley and Brinkley, you wanted to know. Yeah. And having that switch from I want to be entertained to I want to know, I want to be a power, I want to, figure out what's going on in the world. That's what I constantly struggle with when I am designing curriculum and my classes. Just a comment.
I mean, I think any of us who are teaching are living with the sort of 140, sort of word, Twitter feeds is the way in which information is conveyed, and that people actually feel they've gotten on top of some issue because it was in their Twitter feed. And it's a real challenge for the moment. I mean, some of the most exciting frontiers in journalism are trying to figure out how you meet this next generation in a place where you can connect the way in which they're receiving information with the importance of knowing, right? The New York Times virtual reality series, for example, that brought people into refugee camps in a way that a newspaper story never could. And ultimately, things like that are going to be on the cutting edge, but it's a challenge for those of us who teach to think about how we keep this foundational importance of knowing and what knowing is. And it's not the same as being entertained. But I grapple with it too. Every day I go and lecture, I think about exactly that question. So,
I have a question about Stanford and about some of the slides and information that you showed. One thing that was lacking, you showed, the STEM field and so forth, as opposed to global studies and humanities, but you didn't talk about the Graduate School of Business, which arguably has to have some kind of global focus. And I just want you to comment on that, if you could.
Yeah. So I was really focusing my conversations on how we educate our undergraduate population. The Global Studies Division sits in the School of Humanities and Sciences, and so we have responsibility and engagement with both undergraduates and MA and PhD students in humanities and sciences, and for the undergraduate population as a whole. The Graduate School of Business is a different enterprise. It's under the broad umbrella of Stanford. And ultimately, I share your view that preparing students to engage in a kind of interconnected world where there's almost no business you can imagine that isn't involved in international transactions or has some global supply chain is hugely important. The business school is thinking about this set of issues in their own way. We could talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the approaches that they're pursuing. I'd say language acquisition is not high on their list. Lots of short study tours are. Visits to different environments to be exposed to business leaders in these contexts. This is equally important for the law school, frankly, that has to think about sort of the international dimensions of legal work. And I'd say that has not been our focus. Our core focus is the education of our MA and PhD students, and then ultimately the challenges of the undergraduate population writ large. But I think the population that you're describing is super important, but how it's more of an institutional challenge for us, given where we sit. Our ability to shape what that trajectory looks like is much more limited than what we can do with respect to the undergraduate population or our own students in humanities and sciences.
They have a unit in there called Global Innovation Program.
Mm-hmm.
Graduate School of Business does. I was just curious if there was any connection or any outreach or any.
Not much. And I think this is one of our challenges we have a network of 400 affiliated faculty whose research stories would sound a lot like mine. They were interested in particular issues in the world. They chose a disciplinary path. They've rooted themselves in particular regions, cultural contexts to explore these questions. And how we take advantage of that expertise and plug it into the student populations in different parts of campus that really need to be given this kind of global and cultural context is a big challenge, because we're used to teaching our own students, right? But part of the story I'm telling you is that our own students are going elsewhere, right? And that's I think is not just a reflection of how entertaining our classes is, although that could be some of it. But it's a reflection of some profound societal changes that are driving what students choose to study and how they think that they are going to equal the living standards of their parents or exceed them, which is such a challenge in this day and age and really requires a different professional and vocational orientation. And so we have to adapt to meet that moment. But that means asking my faculty to do different things than they would do otherwise, right? That, the course focused on your narrow specialty, your narrow frame that is the passion of your life and the core of your research is very easy to teach, but may not pull in or attract this larger range of students who really need to benefit from broader perspectives that you have, not just the things that you are a primary expert on.
Hi, I'm Patricia Gibbs State. I'm a Stanford Fellow this year, and I teach at Foothill College, and I am the one who had the 317. I did the research on the global studies programs. I'm also a fellow recent Little League parent, so I'd like to talk to you about that at some point, seriously. And I recall shortly after 9/11, I teach at Foothill College, just right over there. And I recall after 9/11, we are generally at Foothill a very, very peace-loving group of people. But after 9/11, we actually had a brawl break out in one of our sociology classes. And then shortly after that, where we had been seeing a drop in numbers in social science students, we saw a massive rise in those numbers that's now leveled off and is kind of tapering off now. And it kind of makes me think about the role of the world in our classrooms, right? And also, I wanted to know what you thought about the kind of contextual things that might affect that number of students dropping or rising in their numbers in certain, like in STEM or social science. And in particular, the role of maybe three things. One, inequality in the United States of America, and what students can actually go to what places for what forms of study, because we know that the majority of high school leavers in the US go to community college, actually. And so what you thought about kind of the role of inequality, growing inequality, where would students go, what would they be amenable to learn? Are they all going to allied health for what reasons? Secondly, what you think about the role, no joke, of our current administration at the federal level, and whether that administration and what students and people see going on in that, whether that may affect people deciding, that it makes them look at the structural level more and go, whoa, is this a man-made or a human-made or a natural disaster like 9/11? It can affect what students decide to study. And sort of what your thoughts are on our growing, speaking of technology, our growing at least kind of awareness of global conflict, and whether that may affect people's choice to go into STEM versus social science. I know that's a lot, but I just kind of wonder what factors.
I'll give you three quick. Well, so first on the broad point, I think what students are interested in is profoundly shaped by what's happening in the world. Again, where they're getting information matters a lot. So if you're seeing it in the New York Times, it doesn't mean that students are necessarily seeing the same information. But I do think that profound effects, and 9/11 was a good example of that. I think Trump will be another good example that shape what students think about. With respect to global conflict, I think most people live in blissful ignorance of global conflict. In the United States, in most parts of the United States, and in most parts of the world. And, if there is a nuclear conflict with North Korea, that will change dramatically for everyone. That's something that we have believed was not possible up until, I think, the last few weeks. But things like that will be a shock to the system for everyone. But mostly, I think people live in blissful ignorance of global conflict, in part because the consequences of global conflict are just not felt very directly sort of here in the United States. So even Russia's invasion of Crimea and annexation of Crimea, which for those of us who care about the international system as scholars and practitioners, is as big an affront to the international system as almost anything that's happened in the last 60 years, for most people, just doesn't affect your day-to-day life. With respect to Trump, I'm teaching an Introduction to Comparative Politics course this quarter, and we just finished our unit on democratization, democracy, regime type, where democracies come from. And the last lecture, last Thursday, a week ago Thursday, before the Comey firing, was on the erosion of democracy. And there's an interesting organization of social scientists in the United States. They've established, it's called Bright Line Watch. And it's designed to say, what do we understand from historical experience that would enable us to identify a set of lines in the sand that we would say are the bright lines after which we should be worried that democratic institutions are being eroded. And one was intentional state efforts, legal state efforts, to undermine the independence of checks and balances, so independent agencies. So students are very focused on what's happening in the world and very much focused on what's happening in the country. And I think we are seeing a sort of rise, who knows how long it will last, in just an interest in trying to get some tools to understand sort of how political attitudes are changing, polarization in the country, how resilient our institutions are because people are afraid. But I also think that when afraid, people turn off. This gets at that issue of agency. I was with 25 students in South Africa from January to March, as I mentioned, and for most of them, they actually wanted to turn off their Twitter feed. They wanted to not log into Facebook, that they felt so disempowered by the changes that were happening in the country that disassociating themselves from it. And what I would worry, disassociating yourselves from what's happening in the country and associating yourselves with California as the wave of the future and the place where everything is fine, I think will ultimately not be a successful long-term strategy for the country. So I think all of us have that challenge. And the last thing I'd just say on inequality, and this is why I'm so excited about the work that all of you are doing, we have an economist here named Raj Chetty who looks at the American dream and basically the likelihood that people who are born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution can rise in the income distribution. And one measure of rising might be, well, what's the likelihood that you go from the bottom 20% up to the top 20% or the top 40% in your lifetime? And he produces a very interesting metric to measure the extent to which colleges and universities in the United States are enabling that movement along the income distribution, which is in part a function of how many students you get from the bottom 20% and then how they do economically. And it wouldn't surprise any of you, I imagine, that the most effective generators of upward economic mobility are community colleges and state universities, massively, to get students into the top 20%, right? And he's got a nice website where you can look at how all the colleges and universities in the US rank on this measure. But it underscores the importance of, if that is where we are going to be addressing issues of inequality, that the work that you're doing to think about preparing that set of students who maybe in high school didn't have even any exposure to this basket of issues, that sort of thinking about our public institutions and our community colleges as key vehicles for advancing this kind of global education, I think is absolutely right. Yeah.
I teach economics, and one thing I'm amazed about is even with learned people, how unaware they are of how tough the economy has been on people for the last decade or two. Because one of the things I'm seeing more and more students, they're seeing people who are older than them, their siblings, maybe their cousins, graduating from college and not getting degrees. So, and many of them
Degrees
are going
not
into
getting jobs.
Yeah, not getting jobs or coming back home. Yeah. And one of the things many of them are, and this is in the data that we presented them in the first day of class, is many of them will have a lower living standard than their parents. But of course, people at Stanford, of course, are probably going to say, hey, where am I going to probably guaranteed to get a good job? Probably in STEM. And they also see that, maybe some of the other places where, even though it's great to have global studies, I mean, I encourage it, but maybe it's the job prospects of spending too much time, the opportunity cost, as opposed to taking more computer science classes, and even then business classes, to support that entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But it may be just, sign of the times.
I think it is a sign of the times. And ultimately, though, when you talk to employers and they tell you what is the most important sort of metric for you in distinguishing those who are going to succeed in these kind of STEM fields and those who aren't, they take for granted the STEM training, and they think about all the stuff beyond the STEM training that makes someone an effective member of a team and able to exist and be successful in a company. Now, we know that's not true for every company, because we know the cultures of these companies vary a lot in some very troubling ways. But ultimately, that's part of the case that that is the challenge that we are confronting as we do this work. I think it is a sign of the times, and it's wrong, I think, in my view, to think that what we're going to do is shift people's incentives and sort of pull them away from fields that may offer them the best prospects to be able to sort of succeed economically in this day and age. The nature and structure of our economy is changing. Parents are very concerned about making sure their children are able to live in a home and raise a family and do all these things that I think many of us took for granted growing up. And so that's why I think global studies, at least as an educational enterprise, needs to radically rethink where it fits, right? And how it engages people in the context in which they are choosing to be, rather than expecting them to come to us. Okay? Yeah? One more question.
So one of the topics that I haven't heard addressed today is on any effort to try and infuse global competency into our strategic initiatives or core values as an institute. Is that an avenue that is worthwhile or futile?
Can you say a bit more about what you mean as an institute?
Talking about an entire institute, whether it's the university or the community college campuses that we come from, and whether we should be expending energy and effort in trying to create a top-down approach to these issues, in addition to the grassroots approach.
Yeah. So, my view on this is yes. And when I talk about the importance of branding and promoting and recognizing, that's often one of the most important, sort of a top-down, a sort of buy-in, a message from your leadership, a sense of resources on the margin that are being allocated in one direction or another. That's how you do these things. Ultimately, in my view, every incoming Stanford student should have presented to them a set of pathways to acquire global competencies, and it should be in their mailing packet, because we want to graduate a certain type of student ultimately from this university. I don't think you can do that without leadership, but I'm also not naive to think that universities, and you can tell me more about the institution that you're at, but the one that I'm at doesn't really function all that well with top-down leadership. Ultimately, people choose this profession because they prize autonomy in various ways. Autonomy in the classroom with respect to what they teach, autonomy with respect to what they research. And so you have to find some mix of persuasion and leadership and ultimately incentives that bring an interested group of people together behind a common vision. I often say that the thing I miss most about government is authority. Government, operates very much in a hierarchical structure. It's not quite the military. It's the polar opposite of the way a university operates. And I think that's fine, but it means that you need to marry that kind of commitment on the part of universities. And I think we see it with our peer institutions as they open campuses overseas and go need blind for international students, something that I hope at some point Stanford will do, where you can get that top-down leadership. But the real challenge with respect to the classroom and the student engagement is mobilizing faculty. And that doesn't happen that well in a top-down way. It means trying to figure out who the set of interested faculty are and how to help them on the margin to achieve ambitions that they have and to recognize competencies that they have to really help students navigate this path. Okay, you've got closing, so let me hand it back, but thank you so much.